Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in 1890 New Mexico, the Saloon of Horrors, when outlaws ate their own. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1890, and the dusty trade road between Fort Stanton and Lincoln cut through a stretch of scrubland few travelers dared to cross alone. The Lincoln County War, still remembered in hushed tones by the older residents, had left behind ghost ranches and empty homesteads. Outlaws moved freely under new names, and what the county called peace was merely a quieter brand of lawlessness. Along this lonely road stood a timber-frame saloon known as the Widow's Rest, operated by Eleanor and Margaret Barlow, sisters from Missouri who had arrived 5 years prior. Their establishment promised food, whiskey, and shelter for anyone passing through, from cattle drovers to railroad men. Yet those who stayed the night often failed to appear in town again. The townsfolk of Capitan whispered about the sisters' quiet manners, their peculiar cooking habits, and their insistence on serving stew, always stew, no matter the season. According to later county records, Deputy Marshal Hiram Cole first logged complaints about the missing men in late autumn. He described the saloon as kept in good order but smelling of iron and smoke. One rancher, Thomas Greer, recalled in his affidavit that he found a bone with a man's boot still upon it, not far from the property, though the claim was dismissed as talk from a drunk. The Barlow sisters themselves were described as pale, unsmiling women. Eleanor, the elder, handled the books and liquor. Margaret cooked and rarely spoke to guests. In a local newspaper clipping dated February's 1891, an anonymous writer hinted, "There's a chill about that place, as though it remembers sins not yet confessed." What lent credibility to the whispers was not the gossip itself, but the pattern that followed. Every month or two, another traveler would vanish, never a local, always a stranger. Wagons left behind, horses found riderless, and letters uncollected at the post office. By spring, the rumors reached the new sheriff, Daniel Price, who had fought briefly during the later skirmishes of the Lincoln County War. Knowing the kind of men who once hid among those hills, he suspected the disappearances were tied to lingering outlaw factions. But when he rode out with his deputy to question the sisters, he found the saloon immaculate. Floors scrubbed, bottles neatly arranged, a fire burning low in the hearth. What disturbed him most wasn't what he saw, but what he smelled. Behind the kitchen door, faint but unmistakable, was the scent of cooked meat, and something else, metallic and sweet, that turned his stomach. That was the first note in what the records would later call the Barlow investigation. And though the initial report was filed without charges, it would mark the beginning of one of New Mexico's most morbid legends, one forever shadowed by the same unrest that once fueled the Lincoln County War. By the following summer, word of the Widow's Rest had spread across the cattle trails, mostly through whispered warnings shared around campfires. Travelers said the stew was good, too good, and that the Barlow women could make even stringy jackrabbit taste like beef. Others spoke of strange noises at night, the sounds of sawing or dragging beneath the floorboards, though the sisters insisted it was just rats in the cellar. Among those who came through that June was Caleb Red Mahoney, a former soldier turned bounty rider known for his temper and suspicion. Mahoney had chased deserters during the final years of the Lincoln County War and had learned to tell when something smelled off. He arrived at the saloon near dusk, his horse lame, his revolver empty of cartridges. Eleanor greeted him with a careful smile and offered supper on the house for a wounded man. Later testimonies in the county file describe Mahoney's supper in grim detail. He ate hungrily, but halfway through the meal paused, frowning at the meat's odd texture. "It was soft," he later told Sheriff Price in his deposition. "Not like any beef I'd known. And there was this taste, like smoke and pennies." He claimed to have lost his appetite immediately, though the sisters encouraged him to finish, saying food shouldn't go to waste in these lean lands. That night, Mahoney said he barely slept. The walls creaked, as though something heavy was being moved. Once, he swore he heard whispering beneath the floor, though no cellar door was visible. Before dawn, he saddled his horse and rode for Lincoln, leaving payment and a note that read simply, "Your stew was kind, but not for me." By the time Sheriff Price returned to investigate, the Barlows said Mahoney had been a drunk who left without paying. Their tone was polite, but defensive. Price noted in his logbook that the sisters appear calm, tidy, habies, and pious, though given to odd silences. He took a short walk around the property, finding only a small smokehouse, several stacked barrels, and an area of freshly turned soil near the well. When questioned, Eleanor said they had laid to rest a mule gone bad. As the investigation stalled, disappearances continued. 2 miners from White Oaks never reached town. A freight driver vanished between Capitan and the Saloon, his wagon discovered abandoned. Locals began to avoid the road altogether, preferring the longer trail through Carrizozo. Around this time, Professor Henry Wallace of the Territorial Historical Society, who had written essays on the lingering anarchy following the Lincoln County War, noted that the moral decay of the frontier remains long after the gunfire fades. His words were later quoted in an 1893 editorial that mentioned the Widow's Rest case in passing, the first time the Saloon's name appeared in print beyond local gossip. By winter's end, the Widow's Rest stood nearly empty, serving only the occasional drifter. The sheriff's office, under pressure from county officials, promised to lay this matter to rest. Yet what they would soon uncover beneath that quiet saloon would echo across New Mexico's darker folklore, a revelation that blurred the line between hunger and horror. In the spring of 1892, the road between Lincoln and Capitan had fallen quiet, patrolled only by the occasional deputy and the odd mail wagon. Most locals refused to stop near the Widow's Rest, but one man, Deputy Marshal Amos Kent, was assigned to inspect the property following the renewed complaints. Sheriff Price, weary from months of dead ends, sent Kent ahead with a simple order. "Look, listen, and write everything you see." Kent arrived in late March, the air dry and still, a storm gathering over the distant Sierra Blanca. The saloon looked unchanged, pale curtains drawn, front porch swept clean, the sign's paint fading to gray. Eleanor greeted him as though expecting a friend. Margaret, as always, hovered in the background, her apron spotless, her eyes fixed on the floor. Kent's official report, later found among the county's unsorted archives, described a strong odor of preserved meat and lye. The sisters explained it as soap-making, though Kent noted they had no soap for sale. During his visit, he observed barrels in the rear room labeled pork, yet the nearest hog farm lay 30 miles away. He also recorded a chilling detail. While speaking with Eleanor, he heard a dull thud beneath the floorboards, rhythmic and wet, as if something heavy swung on a rope. The next morning, Kent did not return to town. 3 days later, Sheriff Price organized a small posse and rode out. Rain had turned the road to mud, and vultures circled above the plain. When they reached the saloon, the doors stood open, but the building was empty. The Barlow sisters were gone. Inside, chairs were overturned, and a trail of muddy footprints led to a trapdoor cleverly disguised under the kitchen table. The discovery beneath that door would become infamous in the annals of Lincoln County. The cellar was small, roughly dug into the earth, lined with hanging hooks, and a table blackened by fiacres. Here barrels filled with salted meat stood against one wall, each sealed with wax. Sheriff Price later testified before the territorial court that he opened 3 barrels, each containing fragments that appeared human. The affidavit remains one of the most disturbing documents ever filed in the county's history. Among the recovered items was Deputy Kent's badge, still pinned to a scrap of uniform cloth. His revolver lay empty beside it. When the news reached Lincoln, panic spread like fever. The Lincoln County War, once a source of pride and legend, was suddenly invoked again in whispers, proof, people said, that the territory never truly healed from its sins. Newspaper editors referenced the war to frame the horror, noting how lawlessness had left a vacuum where conscience should dwell. For weeks, posses scoured the surrounding canyons, searching for the Barlow sisters. Trails led west toward Socorro, then vanished in the desert. A rancher near Nogal claimed to have seen two women traveling under men's coats, but his account was dismissed for lack of evidence. By midsummer, the Widow's Rest stood boarded and silent, guarded by a deputy. Locals who passed at night swore they could hear clinking chains below the earth. Some claimed the smell of smoke and boiled meat still drifted from the chimney long after the fire had gone cold. Sheriff Price retired that autumn, his final note reading only, "The truth is buried deeper than the cellar." And though the investigation would close without resolution, the territory would never forget what was found beneath that lonely saloon, a relic of cruelty born in the same frontier chaos that once defined the Lincoln County War. The official closure of the Barlow case in 1893 did little to quiet the rumors. For years, travelers avoided the old Lincoln Trail, claiming that the air around the saloon carried a foulness that lingered even in winter. Sheriff Daniel Price, now retired and living near Fort Stanton, refused to discuss the case publicly. In a letter to a friend, later discovered in a county archive, he wrote, "I have seen what men can do in war, but I have never seen hunger turn so patient and deliberate." The new sheriff, Emmett Cordero, attempted to restore calm by declaring the site cleared of all unlawful remains. Yet by then, the story had outgrown the evidence. Ranch hands told of voices in the cellar at night. Mail riders claimed to see lamplight flicker through boarded windows. One rancher swore he spotted two women on horseback along the ridge at sundown, faces hidden by veils, riding toward the old war trails, once marked by the Lincoln County war skirmishes. Cordero dismissed such talk, but his deputies were less certain. In a logbook entry dated April 1894, Deputy Jonas Pike recorded finding small fires near the saloon's remains, with bones charred beyond animal size. He buried them quietly, writing only, "No further action warranted." By 1895, the Widow's Rest was sold to a man named Silas Greaves, a prospector from El Paso. Greaves planned to convert it into a way station for stagecoaches. He hired a local laborer, Frank Colby, to clear out the cellar. Colby's testimony, recorded later in the Territorial Record of Unusual Cases, remains one of the eeriest accounts from the period. He claimed the soil beneath the kitchen was streaked black with something oily, and that the air smelled like rust and candle wax. He left after 2 days, refusing payment. Greaves abandoned the project shortly after, stating simply that the place wouldn't stay quiet. Midway through that decade, a small article appeared in the Santa Fe Daily New Mexican referencing Professor Henry Wallace once more, the same historian who had studied the region's violent past. Wallace, known for his pragmatic tone, wrote, "The Lincoln County War left not only widows and ruins, but appetites unchecked by law or reason. The Barlow matter stands as its echo." His phrasing reignited public interest, and the old saloon became a symbol of how far moral decay could reach when frontier justice failed. Over time, travelers began visiting the ruins as a grim curiosity. Some took soil, others scratched their names into the warped boards. A few claimed the cellar door sometimes shifted on its own when the wind passed. These accounts filled the local papers, and though many were likely exaggerated, they ensured the Barlow sisters' legend remained alive in whispers and nightmares alike. By 1898, when the territory was pushing for statehood, officials debated tearing down the remnants altogether. But superstitions prevailed. A foreman sent to oversee the demolition fell ill after a single day on site, convinced he had inhaled the sickness of the dead. The project was abandoned. The Widow's Rest, like the bloodshed of the Lincoln County War, was left to rot into memory, a relic the desert refused to bury completely. By the turn of 1899, the Widow's Rest had become both legend and warning. The official files described the Barlow sisters as fugitives presumed deceased. But among the scattered towns of southern New Mexico and western Texas, stories circulated that two women matching their description were still alive, passing through mining towns under false names. Some said they traveled as nurses, others as itinerant cooks, always offering meals, always leaving before sunrise. The first credible sighting came from Silver City, where a woman calling herself Mrs. E. Marsh briefly worked at a boarding house on Yankee Street. She was said to be quiet, graceful, and eerily calm. After several guests complained of foul-smelling soup, she left overnight, leaving no belongings behind. The boarding house matron later swore the woman's voice matched that of Eleanor Barlow, recalling the clipped, careful diction described by Sheriff Price. Another account emerged from Socorro County, where a tinker named Luis Romero claimed to have met two widows with a cart full of kettles near the Rio Grande. He said their wagon smelled like boiled leather. When he offered to help mend a wheel, the women refused and drove off into the dusk. Romero's statement was entered into the county's missing persons ledger under the heading Possible Barlow Connection, though the case was never pursued. Despite the lack of evidence, the legend fed on itself. Newspapers printed conflicting tales, one claiming the sisters had been lynched in Arizona, another that they'd been seen boarding a train for Kansas City. But none of these accounts could be verified. Professor Henry Wallace, in a later essay for the New Mexico Historical Review, remarked, "In the years since the Lincoln County War, this land has grown skilled at forgetting its own crimes. The Barlow affair endures because it offers no closure." His words resonated across the territory, echoed in sermons and parlor gossip alike. By 1901, bounty posters resurfaced briefly, though the reward had dwindled to $50 each. Younger lawmen treated the case as superstition, but older residents remembered differently. One of them, Marshal Owen Tully, a veteran of the old frontier wars, noted in his diary, "If they're still alive, they've turned into ghosts that eat and move like women." That same year, a traveling photographer passed through Ruidoso and developed a plate showing two women standing outside an adobe ruin. The image, faint and cracked, revealed one of them holding what appeared to be a ladle. Some swore it was the last photograph of the Barlow sisters. The photographer himself died of pneumonia before the plate could be authenticated. The image later vanished from the archives, leaving only its description in a collector's catalog. The region's press eventually tired of the story, yet the unease remained. Locals said the saloon's chimney still stood, blackened and hollow, and that coyotes wouldn't den near it. Travelers reported hearing what sounded like a woman humming when the wind crossed the ridge. And though official records claimed the Barlows were gone, one line in Sheriff Cordero's final report lingered in the margins like a whisper. "If they are dead, the desert keeps them fed." By 1903, nearly a decade after the seller's discovery, the story of the Widow's Rest was fading into folklore. Children dared each other to walk near the ruins, and older ranchers claimed the place was cursed soil. Still, every few years, someone found something: a coin, a button, or a shard of pottery blackened by fire. Each find revived the whispers, each discovery twisting the legend a little more. It was during that year that Dr. Samuel Trenholm, a physician-turned-county coroner, stumbled upon a box of misplaced evidence while cataloging old court files. Inside were pages from what appeared to be Margaret Barlow's journal, wrapped in oilcloth and stained with soot. The handwriting was neat but nervous, the ink faint from time and damp. The entries spanned only a few weeks, but what they contained would send a tremor through Lincoln County once more. The journal began with the words, "Eleanor says I mustn't speak, but the walls remember." Later passages describe shortages, fear of starvation, and the arrival of men who would not pay. One fragment read, "He begged for mercy, and she said hunger knows no sin." Although no dates were written, the language suggested it was penned near the winter of 1891, just months before the sheriff's first visit. Dr. Trenholm presented his find to Sheriff Emmett Cordero, now in his 60s. Together they verified the handwriting against earlier business ledgers from the saloon. The match was certain. The pages were later sealed in a county archive, but not before the Santa Fe Gazette published an article claiming proof of the Barlow confession. It sold out by noon. Professor Henry Wallace, still lecturing on the aftermath of the Lincoln County War, commented in a letter to the editor that such writings reflected the moral famine of a frontier ungoverned by conscience. His words appeared beside a sketch of the sisters that bore little resemblance to their actual likeness, yet fixed their image forever in the public imagination. gaunt, hollow-eyed, and holding a pot over an unseen fire. The journal also included a line that puzzled readers for decades. He was the last who came with papers, the one who knew her name before she did. Some historians interpreted this as reference to Deputy Kent, whose badge had been found in the cellar. Others believed it referred to a man from the sisters' past in Missouri, perhaps a former employer or relative. No follow-up records ever surfaced. After the article's publication, the county courthouse in Lincoln was broken into. Only one item was reported missing: the original journal pages. No suspect was caught. By autumn, a new rumor circulated that the missing pages contained recipes rather than confessions. A traveling preacher from Alamogordo claimed to have seen one of them, describing it as a list of ingredients written like scripture. He said the handwriting ended with a verse: "We eat what the Lord provides." No one ever found that page, but for the next few years, ranchers claimed the old saloon site was sometimes visited at night, lantern light flickering among the mesquite, voices murmuring in prayer. Whether scavengers, collectors, or something older, no one dared to check too closely. Even as the territory changed and new towns rose, the Barlow legend clung stubbornly to New Mexico's dust, another ghost left behind from the long shadow of the Lincoln County War. By 1905, the story of the Barlow sisters had crossed from rumor into religion. A traveling preacher named Reverend Silas Boone, known for his fiery sermons and flair for spectacle, arrived in the Lincoln Territory, claiming he'd been called by the Lord to cleanse the site of womanly sin. He brought with him a small wagon, a silver cross, and 3 followers. According to county ledgers, Boone registered at the Capitan Hotel under his real name, but told locals he was a messenger against the devil's table. Boone announced a public service at the ruins of the Widow's Rest. His circulars called it a cleansing hymn for the women who cooked man's flesh. It was the first time the phrase, "the Sisters' Hymn," appeared in print, and it would soon become synonymous with superstition in the region. The Reverend and his followers set up camp near the saloon's remains, promising to burn the ground and wash it in God's fire. But that night, a storm swept across the plains, lightning striking the old chimney and setting what little structure remained ablaze. Witnesses in Capitan claimed to see the glow as far as the rail depot. The following morning, only scorched stone and twisted iron remained. When locals rode out to investigate, they found Boone's wagon half buried in mud, its contents scattered, hymnals, a cracked lantern, and a leather-bound book singed at the edges. Of the preacher and his followers, no trace was found, not even their horses. The Territorial Gazette reported it under the headline, "Pastor Lost in Cleansing Fire." The sheriff, weary of ghost tales, recorded it simply as death by exposure. In the months that followed, ranchers near the area began reporting a peculiar sound at night, a faint melody drifting over the desert wind. Some said it resembled a hymn sung off-key. Others said it was just the wind through the hollow chimney. Whatever it was, locals began calling it the Sisters' Hymn. Professor Henry Wallace, writing in his final essay before his death in 1907, mentioned the phenomenon while reflecting on the aftermath of the Lincoln County War. He wrote, "Violence leaves an echo. In Lincoln County, the echo takes the shape of song, soft, mournful, and hungry." Though he never visited the site himself, his words once again reignited interest among historians and curious travelers. Around that same time, a family settling near the ruins, the Daltons, reported strange happenings in their letters. Their eldest son, Matthew Dalton, wrote to his uncle, "The ground turns black where it rains, and Mother says the air tastes like iron." After 2 seasons of poor harvest and 1 child falling ill, they abandoned the property, leaving behind only a rusted plow and a half-built barn. By 1908, the government officially declared the site condemned, citing unstable ground and cultural contamination. The last official survey described the soil as too saline for use, yet locals insisted the land itself was cursed, marked not just by blood, but by memory, the kind that seeps into the roots and never lets go. Even today, They say when the wind passes over that low rise near the old trail, it hums a broken tune. Some travelers swear they can make out the words, faint but clear, "We eat what the Lord provides." By 1910, the desert had reclaimed the trail between Capitan and Lincoln. The burned skeleton of the Widow's Rest lay buried under drifting sand and sagebrush, visited only by scavengers and the occasional prospector. Yet that spring the case stirred again, this time from the town of Deming, nearly 200 miles to the southwest. A woman calling herself Eleanor Marsh appeared at the Deming infirmary, suffering from exhaustion and exposure. She was described as thin, soft-spoken, and oddly formal in her speech. Her age, estimated near 60, aligned precisely with what Eleanor Barlow would have been. She bore faint scars on her wrists and a narrow burn mark along her jawline. When asked her occupation, she replied simply, "Cook." The attending physician, Dr. Andrew Klein, recorded her answers in a short medical statement now preserved in the state archives. When asked if she had family, she said, "Only my sister, and she has gone to dust." When questioned about her birthplace, she answered, "Where the wind eats the bones." Klein assumed delirium, but his nurse, Miss Rowena Clark, later wrote that the woman never spoke nonsense twice. A week later, the woman vanished from the infirmary. No record of discharge was filed. A local paper noted the incident briefly under the heading, "Patient missing, likely destitute." But Dr. Klein, disturbed by the coincidence, sent a private letter to the sheriff of Lincoln County, enclosing a sketch and his notes. That letter, discovered decades later in an estate collection, described the woman's eyes as pale and steady, the kind that have already seen judgment. When word reached Lincoln, older residents began whispering again. Some believed the woman was truly Eleanor Barlow, returned to die where it began. Others thought she was a copycat, feeding off the notoriety of the legend. But for Sheriff Cordero, now frail and near retirement, the story reopened an old wound. He sent 2 deputies south to investigate, but they found no sign of her. Only an abandoned shack outside Deming containing a kettle, 2 tin cups, and a faded photograph of 2 women in aprons. One detail chilled even the skeptics. On the back of the photograph was written, in neat cursive, "The Lord remembers." The discovery reignited academic interest. Professor Henry Wallace's students, now teachers themselves, revisited his writings on the Lincoln County War, connecting the Barlow legend to a broader study of frontier moral collapse. One of them, Edgar Kellum, published a small pamphlet titled Echoes of Hunger, arguing that the sisters' crimes reflected the psychological residue of wartime scarcity. His tone was measured, analytical, but the press twisted it into sensation. Headlines screamed, "Cannibal Ghost Returns to New Mexico." Within months, curiosity seekers began visiting the ruins again. Some camped overnight, reporting strange dreams and phantom singing. One miner, Joel Barker, swore he saw a woman in black walking through the sagebrush, her hair streaked white, her hands clasped as if in prayer. He followed her tracks until they vanished near the old well. Sheriff Cordero's final letter to the governor summed it plainly. "Every man I send to chase this story comes back quieter than he left." When he died later that year, his papers were sealed. Among them, one unfiled note read, "If she's alive, let her be. The desert knows what belongs to it." By 1912, with New Mexico on the verge of statehood, local officials sought to clear away remnants of its more macabre legends. The ruins of the Widow's Rest, long considered an embarrassment to the county, were scheduled for excavation by a team of workmen under the supervision of engineer Walter Hensley. Their task was simple: remove the old foundations, fill the cellar, and repurpose the land for a telegraph relay post. Hensley's journal, recovered from his family decades later, paints an unsettling picture of that spring. His first entry reads, "Ground still black as pitch. No grass grows here, though rain falls weekly." He described the soil as damp despite drought, the air metallic in taste. The men worked reluctantly, complaining of nausea and headaches by the second week. On April 3rd, they uncovered the stone lip of the old well, the same one Sheriff Price had once noted for its peculiar smell. Hensley's foreman, James Talcott, ordered it cleared. As the men began hauling debris, a gust of wind rose, carrying with it what Hensley described as a dry odor of burnt broth. One worker fainted outright. Another refused to continue. The following morning, Talcott failed to arrive for roll call. His tent was found undisturbed, his boots neatly placed by the entrance. Inside, on his bedroll, lay the faded photograph that Dr. Klein had once sent north, the image of two women in aprons, identical in every detail. The handwriting on the back was different this time, however. It read, "You cannot fill what was fed." Terrified, Hensley halted the project and rode to Lincoln to file a report. The sheriff's office dismissed it as nerves and sent him back with 2 armed deputies. By the time they returned, the work camp was deserted. Tools lay scattered, wagons half-loaded, fire still burning. No bodies were ever found. The excavation was officially abandoned, and the site was once again sealed under sand and sage. In the months that followed, Lincoln County recorded an unusual pattern of illness among those who had worked the site. Symptoms included persistent fever, nightmares, and a peculiar craving for salted meat. Physicians called it desert malaise. Locals whispered that the ground had taken something back. The Las Cruces Weekly Advocate printed a brief article titled "Cursed Soil Halts County Work," referencing the event and quoting an anonymous official who remarked, "It's as if the land itself remembers." That phrase became part of the growing folklore, spoken alongside tales of the Sisters' Hymn. By autumn, all official records regarding the excavation were ordered sealed by the territorial government, a measure supposedly meant to prevent public hysteria. Yet among the unfiled papers in the courthouse basement, a note written by Sheriff William Ackerley, who had succeeded Cordero, reads, "This is not the first time blood has poisoned the soil of Lincoln. The Lincoln County War began it. The Widow's Rest only finished the work." Even then, few dared to ride past that place after sunset. Travelers said coyotes gave it wide berth. Some nights, distant riders claimed to hear the rattle of pots and a faint clinking of ladles, as if a supper was being served long after the last guests had gone. And though the state would soon declare its new beginning, the ground where the Widow's Rest once stood remained untouched, a dark punctuation mark in the long, unfinished sentence of New Mexico's haunted frontier. By 1915, 3 years after New Mexico entered statehood, much of its darker frontier history had been rewritten for tourists. Guidebooks called Lincoln County a place of brave men and forgotten wars. The truth, however, still lay buried in courthouse basements and yellowing ledgers, records no one wanted to claim. Among them were the sealed files of the Widow's Rest, stacked in a wooden crate labeled "Barlow Matter, Do Not Issue." It was a young historian from Albuquerque, Clara Hastings, who reopened that crate by accident while researching the economic aftermath of the Lincoln County War. Expecting financial ledgers, she instead found photographs, affidavits, and Sheriff Price's early notes, each stained, brittle, and reeking faintly of smoke. Hastings, methodical and skeptical, began reconstructing the timeline and interviewing old residents. What she uncovered would revive the story once more, though in quieter, more academic tones. In her private notebook, she described a pattern. Each investigator tied to the Saloon, Price, Cordero, Hensley, had died under mysterious or premature circumstances. "There is," she wrote, "a consistent erosion of sanity surrounding this case. It consumes men by inches." Hastings also noted how the county's food ledgers showed spikes in unaccounted livestock losses during the years 1890 to 1892, suggesting the Barlow's activities might have been more organized than previously believed. While reviewing the files, she found a small linen envelope addressed to Miss Margaret Barlow. Inside were 4 items: a rusted spoon, a sliver of hair ribbon, a Bible fragment scorched at the edges, and a card reading, "Forgive the hunger." No handwriting identified the sender. Hastings presented her findings to the Territorial Historical Society in Santa Fe. Her report, Echoes in Iron, the Widow's Rest Affair, cautiously referenced professos, for Henry Wallace, noting his observation that the Lincoln County War had left behind a moral wilderness. She argued that the saloon crimes were not isolated madness, but the logical decay of a territory long poisoned by war's aftermath. Her measured words, though academic, carried a quiet chill. The Society published the paper in its 1915 quarterly, where it received polite attention but little public notice. Yet within months, those who handled the Barlow files began reporting odd occurrences, misplaced documents, a lingering scent of smoke, and most notably, a recurring hum heard late in the archive rooms. One clerk, John Arledge, swore he heard a woman's voice whisper the word "eat" when he opened the crate. He resigned the next day. In response, the Society locked the materials again, labeling them contaminated artifacts. Hastings protested, claiming superstition had no place in scholarship. But privately, she confessed to friends that she had begun dreaming of the sisters, standing at her bedside, motionless, holding ladles over a pot that steamed though there was no fire. Her final letter to a colleague read, "There are moments when history stops being about the dead and begins to speak with their mouths." After sending it, she left Santa Fe for Chicago and never returned. The crate remained sealed once more, buried in a university storeroom. And with it, the widow's rest slipped again into silence, half legend, half infection, a story the desert refused to forget, and that historians dared not touch for nearly another generation. By 1917, the Great War in Europe had drawn America's attention far from the ghost towns of New Mexico. Yet in the quiet halls of the University of Santa Fe, a janitor clearing a storeroom came across a wooden crate marked "Property of C. Hastings." Inside were notebooks, sketches, and correspondence tied to her abandoned research on the Barlow case. When catalogued, the crate revealed a trove of first-hand notes that reignited morbid curiosity among the faculty. The university archivist, Dr. Roland Pierce, an even-tempered man of science, began organizing Hastings' papers. His first impression, recorded in his journal, was simple. It feels like opening a window into something that does not want light. He soon noticed peculiar details. Several pages were blank, but faintly stained by circular marks, like cups placed upon them. Others bore impressions of handwriting that seemed to appear only when tilted toward the lamp. Pierce later wrote an article titled "A Frontier's Conscience," published in the 1917 New Mexico Review. He cited Professor Henry Wallace's long-ago observation that the Lincoln County War had fractured more than law. It had fractured morality itself. Pierce proposed that the Barlow sisters, if real, symbolized the hunger bred by an age of chaos, a sickness of the soul rather than the body. The article was sober, thoughtful, and academic, yet something in its tone unsettled readers. A wave of letters poured into the paper, some praising his insight, others warning him to leave the sisters in their graves. Among them was an unsigned note containing a single phrase, "Forgive the hunger, doctor. It's still feeding." That summer, reports began surfacing once more from ranchers near the old trail. Several claimed their cattle were vanishing without prints or tracks, only a dark residue left near the watering holes. A ranch foreman named Elijah Dunn Sabine, or he heard voices at night near the low ridge where the saloon once stood. In a statement preserved by his family, he wrote, "It was like women singing, but the words weren't English." He left the territory within a week. Meanwhile, Dr. Pierce continued to catalog Hastings' papers until his own behavior grew erratic. Colleagues described him as distracted, murmuring to himself during lectures. On September 12th, he failed to appear for class. His office was found in disarray, the crate broken open, and on his desk lay a single spoon, old, rusted, and wrapped in a torn scrap of linen embroidered with the initials M.B. The police concluded he'd suffered a breakdown and fled, but the night watchman, Tomas Herrera, swore he saw Pierce walking out toward the western road after midnight, followed by two figures in long skirts. His account was never officially recorded, but word spread quickly among the townsfolk. By autumn, the legend of the sisters' hymn returned once more, this time sung softly by children near schoolyards. Teachers described it as a nonsense rhyme, But its refrain mirrored the last line of Margaret's journal. We eat what the Lord provides. The newspapers ignored the connection. But among the county's older residents, the fear quietly revived, not of the sisters themselves, but of the idea that their story would never end, only wait for the living to retell it. And as one local put it in an oral history recorded years later, the desert don't bury its dead proper, it just teaches them to whisper. By 1919, drought had returned to New Mexico, cracking the ground and choking the rivers until the Rio Bonito itself shrank to a trickle. In such years, superstition always grew thicker than dust, and once more, the story of the widow's rest rose with the heat. In Lincoln and Capitan, children sang a strange rhyme while skipping rope or playing at dusk. Two sisters stir and never rest. One stirs the pot, one guards the guest. When moonlight falls and hunger wakes, the Lord forgives what hunger takes. Parents scolded them for repeating it, but the verses spread to nearby towns. By midsummer, even teachers began calling it the Hunger Song. Local historians traced its rhythm to early camp hymns collected by missionaries during the Lincoln County War, suggesting it had mutated through oral memory. But the timing was peculiar. How had it resurfaced just as the land grew lean again? That same summer, the Roswell Record published a story titled Echoes of the Widow's Rest, referencing earlier research by Clara Hastings and quoting the late Professor Henry Wallace's moral observation. Every war breeds an appetite that survives its peace. The article argued that the drought's hardship was reigniting old ghost stories as metaphors for starvation. The journalist, Elias Croft, described visiting the ruin site, finding only a hollow in the ground and a single stone marked by the shape of fire. 2 weeks after publication, Croft went missing on assignment near Hondo. His notebook was recovered from his horse's saddlebag. Its last entry read, "Heard the song again at twilight, voices carried by the wind, closer this time." The editor printed only the first half of the journal, omitting the final line. It came from the well. At the same time, a traveling phonograph salesman, John Reddick, claimed to have recorded a ghost hymn sung by children near the Capitan schoolyard. The wax cylinder, labeled Hymn of the Sisters, reportedly captured faint, overlapping voices, the second line barely human. The record was later played during a small exhibition at the university in Santa Fe. According to the audience notes, one listener fainted and another swore she smelled smoke. The recording cracked halfway through, the voices melting into static. It was destroyed shortly after. Even so, Reddick's account rekindled curiosity across the territory. Local pastors denounced the song as Satan's lullaby, while folklorists insisted it was a harmless remnant of frontier myth. But old ranch families muttered that the hymn had power, that each time it was sung aloud, someone in the valley lost livestock, or worse. By late autumn, the drought had grown severe enough that wells began drying completely, except one. The abandoned one near the site of the widow's rest still yielded water, clear and cold. Some dared to take it, desperate for survival. And within weeks, several fell ill with what doctors described as fever of the marrow. The sickness caused faintness, craving for salt, and long, restless nights filled with murmured dreams of cooking something unseen. The county sealed the well that winter, and the land fell quiet once more. But the rhyme remained, humming faintly in the memory of the towns, a reminder that hunger in Lincoln County had never really ended. As one elderly rancher later told a visiting reporter, "You can still hear the hymn if you stand there long enough, but it's best not to listen through." By 1920, the drought had loosened its grip, and slow rains returned to the high plains of Lincoln County. The creeks began to murmur again, washing dust from the bones of cattle long dead. Yet with the water came another kind of unearthing, one that reminded the new generation that the past, though half buried, was not gone. The U.S. Geological Survey dispatched a small team to map the old trade roads and mark potential mineral veins near Capitan. Among them was surveyor Edwin Marsh, a meticulous man known for keeping exhaustive field journals. His entries from that spring, preserved in the Santa Fe archives, are a blend of measurements and unease. April 5, 1920. Stopped for camp near the ridge locals call Widow's Hollow, ground moist, though higher than the basin. Saw remnants of masonry, possibly foundation stones. The men complain of smell, like broth left too long on coals. Marsh was not a man prone to fancy, yet his tone darkened in the following entries. April 7th. Woke to sound of ladle tapping against metal. No wind, no fire. Soil near well damp to the touch, samples to be sent for mineral assay. The sample was never analyzed. 2 days later, Marsh's assistant, George Lane, vanished before dawn. His cot was empty, but his boots remained. The rest of the crew found the old well uncovered, the boards pried loose, the rope line freshly cut. The deputy from Lincoln arrived that afternoon and ordered the well resealed with concrete. He later reported, "Men too shaken to continue work. All speak of singing from below." When Marsh returned to Santa Fe, his health deteriorated rapidly. He suffered fever and disorientation, muttering fragments of prayer and half-sung hymns. His wife recorded in her diary that he would sit upright in bed at night, whispering, "The water's still sweet. She forgave me." He died before midsummer, leaving behind only one unfinished report. That report contained a small sketch, a map marking the exact coordinates of the old saloon, annotated with the words, "Soil still breathing." By autumn, the government quietly removed the area from survey maps, reclassifying it as private ranch land. But rumors spread that the concrete over the well cracked after the first hard frost, and that coyotes began circling it again, howling not at the moon but at the ground itself. An editorial in the Santa Fe New Mexican, written by historian James Kincaid, revisited the case, once again citing Professor Henry Wallace's earlier moral diagnosis of Lincoln County's disease of conscience. Kincaid concluded grimly, "Perhaps it was never about what they ate, but about what this land allowed men and women to become." Still, locals preferred the simpler version. They said the Barlow sisters' hunger had sunk into the earth, feeding on whatever remembered them. And though the telegraph lines were finally laid along a safer route, travelers claimed that at night, when the wind blew from the east, the wires themselves carried a faint metallic hum, like a pot simmering just beyond hearing. "That's the sisters," the lineman said, crossing themselves before moving on. "Still cooking for whoever listens." By 1923, 3 decades had passed since the first reports of the widow's rest cellar, yet the story refused to die. What had begun as folklore whispered in saloons had turned into an uncomfortable chapter of local history, too strange to teach, too persistent to forget. It was during this year that Dr. Lawrence Bell, a young historian from Colorado, arrived in Lincoln County, determined to separate fact from legend. Bell's academic intent was straightforward, to compile a definitive study on post-Lincoln County war violence and its cultural aftershocks. He believed the Barlow affair, stripped of its ghostly ornament, was a cautionary tale about isolation, hunger, and moral decay. "No spirits," he wrote in his first field note, "only starvation and shame, fermented by time." Accompanied by 2 graduate assistants, Bell camped near the ridge once known as Widow's Hollow. The well, long sealed by concrete, was their main focus. They took careful photographs and measurements, noting how the cap had fractured into a spiderweb of hairline cracks. Local ranch hands warned them not to touch it, calling it the sister's breath. But Bell, guided by curiosity and skepticism, ignored the warnings. On the 3rd morning they began to dig. The first layer revealed only dust and stone, but beneath it they found charred timber, broken glass, and, curiously, a handful of porcelain buttons. Bell documented each find with precision. Then, around midday, one of the assistants, Thomas Greaves, a descendant of the prospector who once bought the saloon, struck something solid with his spade. The sound was hollow, metallic. They unearthed what appeared to be a rusted cooking pot, sealed with wax and stamped faintly with the letters M.B. Bell pried it open, expecting animal remains. Instead, He found it empty, save for a scrap of fabric wrapped around a spoon. Etched crudely into the scene, Poon's handle was a single word: forgive. That evening the men built a small fire. Bell's notes from that night show an uncharacteristic shift in tone. Strange warmth in the soil. Smell of smoke returns whenever the wind changes. Greaves says he heard a hymn from the hollow. I heard only wind, or something close. 2 days later, Bell's team returned to Lincoln to develop their photographs. To their surprise, several plates came out fogged, as if exposed to light mid-process. One showed the cracked well cap clearly, but in the blurred center, behind Bell's silhouette, stood 2 faint shapes resembling figures in long dresses. The chemist insisted it was a double exposure, yet the assistants swore no one else had been near the site. Greaves fell ill shortly afterward, complaining of fever and dreams filled with singing. His journal, later found among Bell's effects, described waking each night to the smell of stew and the sound of metal scraping stone. "They stand by the pot," he wrote, "and they wait for it to boil." He died within a week. Bell abandoned the project, his final paper reduced to a cautious essay titled Residual Folklore in Post-War Territories. In it he mentioned the widow's rest only briefly, but his closing sentence echoed Professor Henry Wallace's warning from decades earlier: where the law fails, the hunger remembers. The artifacts collected from the site were shipped to a museum in Santa Fe. Within months, a fire destroyed the entire storage wing. The Barlow relics were never recovered. As for the well, locals say it sealed itself again, as if the ground had grown tired of being opened. And in the years that followed, cattle still refused to graze near Widow's Hollow. The air there remained heavy, faintly metallic, like something still simmering beneath the earth. By 1925, the story of the Widow's Rest had drifted fully into folklore. Its horrors softened into song and superstition. The younger generation knew the Barlow sisters only as figures from whispered tales, sung in quiet tones to frighten children into obedience. Yet to some, the past was not finished. It was only waiting to be heard again. That spring, Dr. Miriam Hogue, a folklorist from Texas Women's College, traveled through southern New Mexico to collect what she called frontier ghost ballads. Among her recordings, made on fragile wax cylinders, were 3 versions of what locals still called the Sisters' Hymn. In her notes, she described it as slow, mournful, in a minor key, with verses often replaced by humming or weeping. One singer, an old ranch woman named Mrs. Dalton, claimed her grandmother had once lived beside the original saloon and could still smell the stew when the wind blew right. Hogue's transcripts reveal chilling consistencies across versions, references to a pot that never cools, a meal that forgives, and the refrain, "We eat what the Lord provides." She noted that children tended to sing it in pairs, one voice echoing the other, as though 2 knew the words and the rest followed. While cataloging these songs, Hogue interviewed a man named Daniel Price, Jr., the son of the first sheriff who investigated the case. By then, in his 70s, he spoke slowly and chose his words with care. "My father," he said, "never feared gunmen, but he feared the quiet of that kitchen. Said he'd smelled it once and never wanted to again." He described his father's recurring dream: 2 women at a table, one stirring, one watching, both whispering grace over an empty bowl. He said the prayer always ended the same: forgive the hunger. Hogue intended to publish her findings under the title Songs from the Hollow. But during her stay in Lincoln, she received a visitor, a man claiming to be Dr. Lawrence Bell, though by then Bell had not been seen for nearly 2 years. The hotel clerk later testified that he was thin, sunburned, with eyes gone cloudy. He told Hogue he'd returned to finish the listening. She recorded his statement on wax. "They don't want to be remembered. The well sings so no one forgets." The next morning both were gone. Their belongings remained, save for Hogue's recorder and the cylinders containing the Sisters' Hymn. In the hotel register, a new line had been written beneath her name: "Forgive the hunger. The pot is full again." When investigators searched the old ridge days later, they found fresh boot prints near the cracked concrete cap, one set large, one small. The prints ended abruptly at the well's edge. Afterward, all government interest in the site ceased. The area was fenced off, officially labeled private property, erosion hazard. The remaining settlers said they sometimes saw lantern light there, faint but steady, as though someone were tending a hearth. In her final correspondence, discovered years later, Hoag had written to a colleague, "If you listen long enough, you realize it isn't the dead that haunt the living. It's the hunger they leave behind." By 1930, the territory that once bled from lawlessness had settled into the rhythm of a new state, yet the widow's rest endured as a quiet blight on its history. Those who remembered the story were dying off, and those who inherited it spoke of it only in fragments. A tune half-hummed, a name avoided at supper. In that year, the University of New Mexico Folklore Society announced a project to preserve local ghost stories and pioneer songs on phonograph disc. Among the lists submitted by county clerks appeared one curious entry from Lincoln. The Widow's Hymn, origin uncertain. The student assigned to record it, Harold Myers, visited Capitan in May. His diary, recovered decades later, captured his confusion. May 10, 1930. Locals hostile to subject. One woman spat when I said the name Barlow. Others denied any such hymn existed, though I heard two children singing what matched Hoag's notation in the square. They stopped when I approached. He spent the night at the old mail station, now a boarding house. The keeper, Mrs. Johnson, told him that her husband once rode the trail past the ruins. He said the air there feels full, like you're walking through steam, and if you're fool enough to whistle, you'll hear harmony come back. Myers found the site the next morning. His last written note reads, "Concrete cracked. Smells faintly of brine. A sound like boiling beneath the sand." He never returned to Santa Fe. Weeks later, his empty wagon was found near the ridge, the recording discs missing. Not long after, a letter arrived at the university, unsigned, written in faint ink, sealed with wax. It contained a single disc wrapped in linen and labeled The Last Supper. The accompanying note read, "Do not play this where the hungry can hear." When a technician eventually tested it, the surface hissed and popped as though damaged by heat. Beneath the static came a sough. Low rhythm, two metal taps, then silence, then a voice humming what scholars later identified as the same melody transcribed by Dr. Hoag in 1925. Midway through the recording, the sound changed, as if another voice joined in, deeper, echoing faintly through space. Listeners described it as a kitchen hymn sung through iron. After that playback, the disc reportedly shattered. No copy was ever made. The society quietly withdrew its project from Lincoln County altogether. By then, the Depression had driven most of the younger families from the region, leaving behind weather-beaten ranches and the skeleton of the telegraph line that once skirted Widow's Hollow. At night, travelers swore the wires hummed when the wind shifted east, a low, steady tone like a kettle about to boil. In 1933, a journalist for the Albuquerque Tribune wrote a retrospective on New Mexico's unsolved legends. He devoted one paragraph to the widow's rest, quoting the familiar line from Professor Henry Wallace, who decades earlier had warned that the moral wounds of the Lincoln County War never truly closed. The writer added his own grim flourish. If conscience could rot, it would smell like that kitchen. No official record of the hymn or the recording survives. But on moonless nights, ranchers still swear that if you stop by the old trail and listen long enough, you can hear two women singing far below the earth, one leading, one echoing, keeping the supper warm for whoever still remembers them. By 1937, most of Lincoln County's older residents were gone, and the last who remembered the Barlow sisters spoke of them as myth. But in Santa Fe, curiosity returned again. A young historian named Evelyn Corbett, working on a doctoral thesis about the psychological residue of the Lincoln County War, stumbled upon a file labeled Restricted, Widow's Rest Materials. Inside were scorched photographs, fragments of song lyrics, and the charred remains of a wax cylinder. The inventory sheet bore one chilling annotation: Hoag Collection, Partial Salvage, 1926 Fire. Corbett was fascinated. She saw in the Barlow case a metaphor for post-war trauma and deprivation. These were women caught in the hunger left by men's wars, she wrote in her preliminary notes. Her advisor cautioned restraint, yet she persisted, securing permission to reopen the long-forbidden crate that once held Clara Hastings' papers. What she found was unlike any academic collection she had handled before. Many pages were fused together, warped by heat. Others were blank, but smelled faintly of grease and smoke. In the bottom corner of the crate, she found a small metal tag etched with the initials E.B., scorched but intact. She kept it in her pocket as a souvenir of forgotten crimes. In early October, Corbett arranged to visit the old site near Capitan, then overgrown and fenced by a private rancher named Joseph Reddick, said to be a distant relative of the phonograph salesman who had once recorded the sisters' hymn. Reddick refused her entry at first, saying, "That ground eats what steps on it." But she offered him $50, a large sum in Depression years, and he relented, warning her to finish before dark. Corbett described the place in a letter to her colleague in Denver. "The earth feels soft here, as if it's still cooking from within. A low hum comes when the wind passes through the stones. The air tastes metallic, like blood in a tin cup." She photographed the cracked concrete well cap, still fractured like old bone. At the base, she claimed to find traces of ash mixed with what appeared to be animal hair. Before leaving, she pressed the metal tag against the stone. "To mark the site," she said. That was her last recorded action. The following week, a fire swept through the Regional Archive building in Santa Fe. It burned through the West Wing where Corbett's materials were stored. Investigators never determined a cause. Witnesses reported a chemical smell and a faint singing sound before the flames took hold. Everything connected to the widow's rest, photographs, journals, wax remnants, was lost. Corbett herself vanished 2 days later. Her rented car was found abandoned halfway between Lincoln and Carrizozo, its engine cold, her suitcase inside. The sheriff noted no signs of struggle, though he mentioned in his report that the vehicle smelled faintly of burnt stew. On the passenger seat lay only her field notebook, open to a single line. "They remember who forgets." That fire marked the last official trace of the case. The Historical Society declared the material beyond reconstruction, closing the widow's rest file for good. For the public, it was as if the story had finally burned itself out. Yet in the desert, the locals still whispered otherwise, that when the flames rose over Santa Fe, the wind carried with it the sound of two voices, humming through smoke, soft and steady as breath. And from that night onward, the stars above Lincoln seemed, for a time, to flicker like coals. By 1940, the desert had swallowed nearly every sign of the old trail between Capitan and Lincoln. The telegraph poles leaned like worn gravestones, their wires long silent. Wind had filled the hollow of the widow's rest with sand and sage. From the highway, travelers saw only a dip in the earth and perhaps the glint of something metallic beneath the dust. Few knew what had once stood there. Fewer still cared to ask. The name Barlow had faded from public record. No plaque, no monument marked the spot. Yet in old libraries and courthouse basements, curious researchers still stumbled upon brief, unsettling mentions. A sheriff's affidavit, a yellowed clipping, a burned margin note. The legend endured not in the evidence, but in the absences between it. One of the last references appears in a 1940 state inventory report, noting an unidentified private parcel, unsuitable for development due to ground instability. The surveyor, Francis Hale, added a personal remark. "The soil sinks softly when stepped on, as if hollow beneath. The air carries a scent of salt and smoke. Locals won't stay past dusk." Folklorists who revisited the region that year found the hymn almost forgotten. Only a handful of elderly residents could recall its melody. They hummed it in fragments, the tune slower now, like a dirge worn thin by time. One woman, the granddaughter of a sheriff's deputy, said the last words were different than before. Not, "We eat what the Lord provides," but "We rest where the Lord forgives." No one knew when the words had changed or why. In Santa Fe, Professor Henry Wallace's surviving essays were republished in a single volume. In his earliest writings on the Lincoln County War, he had warned that the frontier's moral famine would outlast its gunfights. In a later essay, one rarely quoted, he wrote, "Some crimes are not committed by hands, but by silence. They linger until the land itself remembers the hunger." His words resurfaced briefly among scholars, then vanished again, as though the story had finished feeding on attention. By the end of that decade, the last ranch near Widow's Hollow was abandoned. Cattle refused to graze there. Locals claimed the water tasted wrong, faintly sweet, faintly metallic. Those who rode by at night said the wind changed pitch when passing the hollow, as if sliding across a hidden mouth in the ground. Some heard nothing. Others heard two faint notes, a harmony, rising and falling like a sigh. No one ever rebuilt on that land. Every proposal failed, by weather, by cost, or by accident. The deeds changed hands and then disappeared into bureaucratic dust. Today, the site remains unmarked, known only to those who remember what was said in quiet kitchens long ago. That the Barlow sisters never left, because hunger doesn't wander, it waits. And on still nights, when the desert cools and the stars burn low over Lincoln County, travelers swear they can hear it, the soft clink of iron against stone, a pot stirring somewhere beneath the sand, a woman's voice murmuring grace. Forgive the hunger. The wind carries the echo east, across the long-forgotten trail, over the ruins of the war that birthed it all. And then, like breath leaving the body of the earth itself, silence.